Well, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement sphere come to hear experts in their field talk about their work, their experience, and their research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical elements of training in motor learning and crisis decision-making. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and my name is Chris Butler, and I'm your host for today. It's my pleasure to have on today's show Doctors John and Dawn O'Neill. And so I'll introduce them and then we'll get into the research paper that we're going to be talking about today. So Dr. Dawn O'Neill has over 10 years of research and clinical experience working with populations across the lifespan, from adolescents to older adults. She holds the highest designation in behavior analysis, the board certified behavior analyst doctoral. Dr. O'Neill has a PhD with a specialization in behavior analysis and therapy, a master's degree in clinical psychology, and 2 bachelor's degrees in psychology and criminal justice. Dr. O'Neill is a certified force science analyst and advanced specialist. She has published peer-reviewed articles in the fields of behavior analysis, police psychology, ergonomics, and exercise science. She's interested in the application of behavioral psychology to improve socially significant behavior across populations. Her current research interests are related to severe problem behaviors, contextual ethical considerations, the intersection of behavioral and pharmacological treatment, skill acquisition, and skill maintenance. Dr. John O'Neill has over a decade of experience in research and administration and has published various works, including book chapters, peer-reviewed scientific research, and professional magazine articles. John has served as the founder of the Contextual Behavioral Science Institute, or CBSI, host of the Public House podcast, director of research at the Judge Rottenberg Educational Center, on the editorial board of the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science, and as chair of the Dissemination of Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group. He's also a certified force science analyst and advanced specialist. The CBSI is a collaborative effort between scientists and practitioners who are passionate about the objective and pragmatic understanding of police academy training and firearm safety. The CBSI aims to solve important societal challenges through novel adaptations of behavioral sciences. Well, Dawn and John, Doctors O'Neill, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen.
Thank you for having us.
Hey, Chris, thank you.
Yeah, well, so we're going to be talking today, and I'm so glad that you're here. We're going to look at diving into the research that both of you were instrumental in conducting on police academy training. And just for our viewers, that study, and it'll be appended to the notes, the show notes, the study is Police Academy Training, Performance and Learning. Police Academy Training, Performance and Learning. And this was published in 2018 in Behavior Analysis in Practice. So first of all, John and Dawn, can you tell us why did you undertake this study? Why was it important? What were you hoping to explore? What were the issues that sort of pressed you into this area of study?
Sure. So in the beginning, we were working with a team of researchers, and we were often looking at different dynamics of use of force incidents, and training always came up. The officers would talk about how they relied on their training, or their training came to the forefront, and they engaged in these actions without really thinking about them. And so we wondered about training, and we wondered about skill retention, and what do skills look like after they're trained once an officer moves into the field? How long do those skills continue to occur at a high level of performance? So we were initially interested in skill retention. But then we took a step back and we realized we're operating off of the assumption that the skills are trained to a high level of mastery to begin with, which I think is a fair assumption, especially as a civilian looking at officers and training the academy. They go through all of these steps in this rigorous physical training and all of these evaluations that make them a certified officer. But we took a step back and we're like, as researchers, it's our job to gather data and to understand and not just make assumptions that skills are trained to mastery, but we need to start there first. So then we started to ask questions about skill acquisition, of how skills are taught, to what level of mastery, what does that training look like? What's the duration of training? How many sessions? Are we seeing training occur in the typical check the box format for a lot of law enforcement training? Or are we seeing more spaced, continuous sessions with a lot of skill building that starts simple and moves to complex, that starts static and moves to more dynamic situations, that starts with more training of rehearsal and repetition, moving into more scenario-based training throughout the academy? And once we understand that, then we can really begin to also examine skill retention over time.
Right, and as researchers, one of the first things we do is jump into the literature and see what evidence is already there. And when we did that, we found nothing. I mean, there were a handful of very subjective analyses of police academy training, but there was nothing very objective and solid to establish sort of the baseline of what police academy training looks like. How is it done? How is it conducted? What are the general outcomes? We didn't have anything to go off of. So we went from going in with a well-designed intervention to try and improve training to just looking at what are the basic outcomes of academy training.
So on that point, John, so the lack of I guess, an evidence-based pedagogical approach that you observed there in the law enforcement sphere, is that something that like, is that odd? Like, in your exposure to other domains outside of law enforcement, is that a typical thing that we would see, or was this something that was problematic for you as from a research perspective?
I mean, it's problematic, but I wasn't particularly surprised. As we were mentioning just before we started recording, in our own fields of clinical behavior analysis, we run into a lot of the same issues. Training funding, a lack of consistency across what departments and states. So I wasn't particularly surprised, but from a research perspective and from an empirical standpoint, it's a problem.
Okay, so you briefly sort of outlined some of the aspects that you were exploring in this study, but maybe can you just paint us the picture? Like, so what were the research questions that you set out in your paper to explore?
Yeah, so the main research question was, what are the outcomes of the actual training, and can we objectively quantify that? Then on top of that, we wanted to look at these skills are developed to a certain level, and then how long do they last afterwards? Are we talking weeks, months? And the general idea was to come up with a recommended time frame for retraining.
Okay, so basically if I understand what you just said correctly, is you're looking at as far as the effectiveness of the skills, and we're talking about, you were exploring motor skills, right? So, and you're going to get into that when you describe the paper. So self-defense type of motor skills in the law enforcement academy. So you were interested in, does that training, are officers able to both retain it and then transfer that skill effectively into the operational space? Would that be a sort of a correct interpretation of what you were looking at?
Yeah, that's accurate. Yeah, we were trying to basically provide the foundational evidence to build future studies off of. So this is what police academy outcomes generally look like. This is how long those skills typically maintain. And now how do we build off of that and design other or improve the trainings in future studies?
Now, this is very important because, in my experience, and when I talk to other trainers from other academies around North America, this is just something that no academy is really doing. I mean, we as law enforcement invest literally billions of dollars in training police officers, but there's been very little validation of, so what are the skills that they actually need? Have we correctly even done a threat or a needs analysis of what are the skills they need? And then can we teach those skills to officers in the time that we have? What's the best methodology to test them? And nobody is bringing officers back after the academy to go, are the skills that we trained you in, can you even use them? So the study that you did here is just phenomenal. And now, as I understand it, you were actually in this one study, you had kind of like 3 sub studies that you did within the envelope of this study. So can you describe what those 3 studies were and what the experiments were that you undertook?
Yeah, so initially, from a research standpoint, we want an experimental design that's going to have a lot of strengths to it. But what we quickly found was that each of the regional academies that we were going to work with took different approaches. They taught different skills. They did it in a different way, and their training schedule was different as well. So one of the academies had a single hour-long training essentially for a particular skill, and that was their approach. From day to day, they would teach different skills in 1-hour blocks. Another academy had what we would call space training. So they would have one initial training, but then they would come back and kind of hit that skill again multiple times. So that was the second experiment. And then the third one was similar to the first in that they had an hour block, but they then gave us the opportunity to provide some feedback to the instructors on how they might be able to improve the overall performance of the group. So the third study is the most interesting for us because we got to give them some feedback, and we actually demonstrated that with some simple feedback and train the trainer sort of approach, we were able to increase the overall performance of the entire academy group by a little over 10%, I believe.
Wow. And that was just, and we'll get into all these studies as we go along, but that feedback that you gave was just a very small burst of feedback, and you saw that dramatic improvement. And so we can imagine if they actually had a good pedagogical approach to how they trained and how they did feedback, there could be some very amazing results in that. So in your introduction to the paper, as I read through it, you mentioned that although skill proficiency testing is conducted, and you said in 93% of academies, there's no evidence that this testing is either standardized or objective. And so can you explain that? Like why, what do you mean by that? And why is that a concern?
So it's a concern because most of the testing is subjective. So of course, all of the trainers are experts in teaching these skills, and they know exactly what they're looking for. However, each instructor is going to have a slightly different criterion for passing the students or saying that skill has been acquired. And you see the same thing in martial arts academies as well. Typically the instructor is going to pass or graduate an individual onto another belt, for example, using a subjective. Essentially, they observe the person performing whatever skills are needed, and they say, yes, you did it correctly, or no, you need some work. But it's a concern for us because of the lack of consistency across academies, even across individual instructors at the academies, because one instructor's pass rate might be slightly different than another. So there's a bit of a lack of consistency there. So one of the things that we wanted to do was establish an objective way to measure skill performance. And what we did was develop what we call task analyses. So basically, If you have a skill, you break it down into its individual steps. And then when we go to score, we're actually checking whether or not each one of those individual steps was done correctly. And we did that through video analysis after the fact. But what we found was that our objective evaluation of the skills was quite different than the instructor's subjective evaluation of the skills.
And so we had a situation, which you wouldn't find in the paper, where we spent a lot of time with a phenomenal academy they developed a task analysis. They developed a step-by-step breakdown with photos of a skill that was going to be trained, that was going to be included in the study. However, when it came to training day, it was a different instructor that trained the skill, and they trained it differently. So all that work that had been created to develop this amazing task analysis wasn't actually applied in the training environment. So that just goes to show you too, that not only is it important to have an objective system of measurement, but then if that is what the skill should be, then that should be trained in the training environment. And we see that variability amongst instructors. So the instructors themselves need to all be trained on the same procedures and the same steps to follow that same outline.
That's fascinating. What was your experience with, so, you know, when I look at the athletic world and you look at high level athletics and, you know, Olympic level coaching, is like in those domains, the coach, most importantly, knows how to get the student or the athlete to learn. And so it's a very athlete-centered approach. Like the coach doesn't need to be an Olympic level performer in order to bring their students up to a very high level of performance. So I'm interested in your review of these academies. Was it common for law enforcement trainers to not have like a very well-developed understanding of coaching and training and a pedagogical approach, or what approach did they take to their training?
Yeah, so I mean, we found that, you know, these folks, the trainers they're hand selected because they're experts at performing these skills. However, being an expert at performing a skill doesn't necessarily mean that you're an expert in teaching that skill. So we found that a lot of the trainers didn't provide quite enough or frequent enough feedback to the individuals. And there were a handful of other things that we were able to kind of give them some tips on and kind of refresh. But to your point, they didn't necessarily have an extensive background in how to actually teach or train.
There was what we saw in some of the academies was a sort of instructor stance in which they would be back away from some of the recruits with their hands crossed. You might get a little head nod as feedback. And so one of the most profound things for them that they told us was acknowledging that they needed to give more positive feedback to the recruits. Not only asking the recruit to perform a skill again, but being able to provide that differential feedback of here are the specific areas for improvement and ensuring those are in fact specific parts of the skill, but also the praise and making it genuine, authentic, and very specific for what the recruit did well, because they're new learners. They're performing these skills for the first time. So getting that positive feedback is so important.
Yeah, we found that there was a heavy focus in the beginning on correcting what was done wrong, as opposed to focusing on what they had done correctly and building off of that.
Interesting. One of the things that I read a report out of the UK, and I think it was published in 2017 or 2018, so right around the time of this study, but Cushion did an analysis of law enforcement training. I think it was with London Met. And when he examined the academy training, he found that of all the time that the officers, so if you say, you know, an officer gets 40 hours of this type of training, what he found is that only about 26% of the training time, the officers were actually involved actively in training. The rest of it was the instructor talking, the instructor demoing. And so a very poor use of the time that was available. Did you see something similar to that in your academies?
Yeah, we did. I mean, they were pretty good about demonstrating the skill modeling at first and showing all of the steps and giving making the time for repetitions and actual practice and feedback. But I do think that it could have been better spent and less time um, with the instructor essentially standing in front of the class and explaining what the skill is and why they're going to use it, as opposed to focusing more of that time on repetitions and feedback.
And sometimes the amount of repetitions, the amount of time for different skills was similar. So for a quick skill, you're going to get a lot more repetitions. With the more complex, lengthy skills, there are fewer repetitions. So then you have fewer learning trials, which is also an artifact of training we notice.
Right, right. So one of the points you make in your article, and I think this is really important, is that academy training is not developing motor skills that officers are able to retain and transfer into the operational work context. So in making this statement, you also state that if officers are not fluent in their ability to perform physical control skills, they are more likely to have to escalate force to get control. Now, that certainly seems like a logical conclusion, but are you aware of, is there specific research that you were relying on to make that statement prior to that study, or where did that statement come from?
No, I think we said they may be more likely to rely on higher levels of force, but yeah, it's a sort of a logical conclusion that we came to, but it's not based on any research that's out there. We just feel that if somebody is not confident in their ability to perform a particular skill and they are confident in their ability to use a particular tool, they're probably going to go to that tool as opposed to going hands-on, for example, and trying to use some sort of ground control tactic.
Yeah.
And the research, limited research that does exist, shows us that skill performance is higher under these innocuous conditions, when something's static,
Right.
when the environment's simple, when there's not decision making under stress, when there's not a lot of unknown variables and evolving threats, performance is higher. And even in the research context, when you add a little bit of stress and a little pressure, a go no go decision making situation, performance starts to degrade. And if we see that in training, if we see that in research, then it just is the logical conclusion that you would see a lot more of that in the field, when the intensity and the pressure, when the speed of the interaction with another human being with so many unknowns continues to evolve so quickly in such a short period of time.
And I think you're 100% accurate in that assumption, Don. In my experience as a law enforcement trainer and as a use of force investigator for over 20 years now, is there's been so many cases where officers have initially gone hands-on with somebody and they were, because of just performance ineffectiveness, they were not able to get control. And so as that event continued, the officers are forced to escalate. We see a very heavy reliance on tools, and it's almost like there's been this interesting shift in law enforcement away from being able to go hands-on and very quickly stop an event and get control of it and end it, and to a reliance on tools that are on the belt. And we consistently see an escalation of force when that happens. So let's look at this study now, and you can do this however you want. You had 3 experiments that you were looking at. So can you walk us through the study design? How did you carry out the study? And again, you can go through each experiment if you want, or just talk generally about it, but how did you do the study?
Want me to do that one?
Go ahead.
Well, we started out developing a way to actually objectively measure these skills. So there was a lot of front end work in developing task analyses. What are these skills? What do they look like? A lot of consulting with the trainers, video recordings, and then developing these lists, these checklists for each of the skills. And then obviously we had to work with a class of cadets and we had to work on their schedule as well. So there were multiple trips out to these academies at different time points. So we had some baseline measures, right? So we want to make sure that folks in these classes don't already have some of these skills. So we call that baseline. So we had multiple baseline points where we just made sure that they were low performers to begin with. They didn't already know the skills. And then the trainers conducted their training and we assessed them immediately before and immediately after the training to see what that improvement looks like in the overall performance. So we had individual level performance before and after training, and we had group level performance before and after training. And when you look at the charts, you'll see a spread of basically the low to the highest performers and the percentiles in between. Then we wanted, after the initial training, we wanted to come back at different time points. So we came back at 1, 2, 4, and 8 weeks, I believe. And we again just assessed where the training was at without any retraining. And that showed us the overall degradation of the skill over about a 4-month period. And we sort of, it was the similar approach with experiment 2 and experiment 3. So essentially what we were just trying to establish is, what is the baseline for these groups? What is the impact of the training that's conducted at these academies? And then what does that skill degradation look like over time? So we're just trying to get an idea of when would a retraining be ideal? So, and that's a question for the training world is, if a skill is performed, let's say after the initial training at a 90% level, that's our mastery criterion, right? At what point do we need to retrain? Is it at 80% when the skill drops to that level? Is it at 70%? Is it, where is it that we need to consider retraining? But basically what our studies demonstrate is that the approach that a lot of academies take, which is initial training and then come back once a year to retrain, is definitely not sufficient. What we suggested, I believe, in the paper is that at minimum, a quarterly retraining on physical motor skills is necessary.
And in addition to the overall percentage, the drop from, let's say, hypothetically 90% to 80 to 70, at what point do you decide when training needs to recur? We also talked about essential components of the skill. That if you do a task analysis and you've got these 10 steps and they miss one step, that's a 10% off already. But is that an essential part of the skill, or is that just nice to have? So when we studied the rear disarming of a firearm, stripping the firearm would be very important. That would be a critical step. So that's perhaps an automatic fail. So being able to define those things too, that it's not just the overall score 0 to 100, but are these critical components of the skill present, and are they fluent enough that they would be successful?
Okay, so you've mentioned a variety of skills that you explored or that the academy taught. So can you tell us, like, what were the skills you were looking at? You mentioned the rear disarming. So you had a rear disarming technique where I guess it would be an offender had a gun pointed at the officer's back, and the officer has to make a maneuver to defeat that attack. What other types of techniques did you explore?
Yeah, there was a handcuffing technique. There were a couple of pressure points techniques in there. There was a baton strike. We even used a front snap kick as a control skill. So the idea with the control skill was we didn't train that at all. It's just an experimental design piece that we added in. to show that that skill just maintained at relatively low levels without the training. So that was just an experimental piece. But yeah, so ideally what we would have liked to look at was the same skill across all these academies. But like we mentioned before, we quickly found that all of the academies taught different skills in different ways. So we tried to pick skills that were that seemed relevant to us and that would have some carryover from experiment to experiment. But it was highly reliant on the training schedule and our ability to actually set up and conduct the studies.
And for these initial studies, it was important from a research standpoint that we try and target skills and analyze skills that aren't repetitively taught. So we had to be careful with the skill building that was already there and try and limit that, because the more skill building that occurred outside of our analysis, the less that we can determine the effect of that initial training on all of our follow-up tests. So we purposely try to examine some skills like the redisarming of a firearm that might be actually less likely to be used throughout the academy as well as in the field for research purposes, simply as a starting point. And we also want to look at skills, the front snap kick. It's a control, but it's also very simple. And the instructors were like, why are you making them do a front snap kick? We don't train that. We wouldn't ask them to do that. Why are you taking these baseline data sessions? And that was all for research purposes so that we have more assurance that it's the training that had an effect on recruit performance and not any other factors or variables. So that just helps us build strength for our research design.
Okay. That's a fascinating study. And I want to ask you a question about the retention or the booster training that you recommended. So, you had said quarterly at minimum based on what you saw from these academies. And my question on that is, so do you think that if academies had used a different, maybe more effective approach to teaching motor skills, like a more pedagogical informed approach to teaching, do you think that might make a difference as far as the retention and transfer of those skills? And would that then mean maybe the time frame for booster sessions might change, because you were just exploring what the way that these academies taught these skills?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a different approach, one that incorporates a lot of the very well-established scientific principles, and one that is more in line with the feedback that we provided in experiment 3. I think that that's going to have some effect, especially on the initial training and the mastery of the skill initially. Whether or not it has a what we would call a clinically significant impact on the long-term retention is yet to be discovered. But I still think that the more training, the better, right? Like the more often you train and the more often you revisit those skills, the better your retention is going to be, and the higher your performance is going to be in the field. So I think the big takeaway from our studies is that we can do a lot more with the resources that academies have. We can be much more efficient and effective in delivering that training. But at the same time, academies and departments, we think, need to commit much more time and energy into retraining on a regular basis. And we see that in our clinical setting as well. I mean, typically our folks go through their initial what would be academy training, and they have a retraining once a year. They get a lot of sort of booster sessions on the job from more experienced staff, but ideally we would like a certain proportion of their weekly hours to be dedicated to training. That would be the ideal approach, in our opinion.
Yeah, and thanks, John. And so for the trainers that are watching this, just to be clear, because one thing when we talk about that the importance of that ongoing verifiable training throughout the officer's week and month of their shift work. You know, training can look like a lot of different things, can't it? Because sometimes we get in our minds, we're thinking, oh, how do we get them back into the mat room or whatever to do training? But there's lots of creative ways that trainers can do micro training sessions, even using imagery and things like that to help continue with that boosting effect, right? So when you talk about the importance of ongoing training, it can look like a lot of different things, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the last 3 to 4 years, we've been working with New York State to revise their entire training curriculum. So basically incorporating behavioral science into their training curriculum. And one of the pieces that we came up with for ongoing training are these little training videos. So a little 5 to 10 minute training video that an officer can access on their free time, or if they have, it's just a really short 10-minute video. But if you have hundreds of those that officers can go in, refresh on a particular skill, I think that's one way that's very useful, where you can incorporate technology. I mean, everyone has a smartphone, right? You can just pull it up on your phone and get a little booster session on your cell phone.
Yeah. So John, maybe, or Don, you can add on to this, because I think what you just mentioned is something that's not well understood by defensive tactics or firearms trainers, is in that in a lot of ways we get locked into this thinking that motor skill training can only be done in a motor skill environment where we're physically actually doing something. But there's a lot of research that speaks about the effectiveness of how even motor skills can be retained and even improved just by observational learning and by imagery and things like that. So can you speak to the effects of that type of training as well?
Yeah, and I can mention something. For one of our studies, we actually did live modeling of an instructor live modeling the skill, and compare that to the same instructor but a video of the instructor to perform the skill. And the result on recruit performance of the skill was 1 percentage point different. They were almost identical. So then you've got the video that's the same for every recruit that sees that video. It's the same material, it's the same training, it's the same exposure. So that creates consistency, and that's important. And you supplement that with physical training, but the video pieces to training are can be easily disseminated for the recruits and for officers on an ongoing basis. And we talked as well about having the officers videotaped and then playing back their performance for them, so they can see themselves on video, and then the instructor can go through and they can even pull up the video of the exemplar, the perfect example of the skill, and compare it to their own. And you can ask them to troubleshoot and say, how are you different from the exemplar?
Mm-hmm.
What did you do well? What could you have done differently? Why don't we slow it down? Let's rewind. Let's watch it again. So you can break it down, and then you could show it to them in one fluid motion as well.
Yeah, and I just recently started training in jiu-jitsu, and I can't tell you how many classes I come out of where I'm running through the skill in my head, like visually imagining how I did it, which steps I think I got correct, which steps I think I got wrong. And if I had a video of me performing the skill to refer to, there's a lot of problem solving that I can do on my own to correct and improve my own performance. I don't necessarily need an instructor there. If I have a training model and a recording of myself performing the skill, there's a lot of improvements that I can make by myself on my own time outside of that training context.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so in your first experiment where you were looking at the block training, one of the things that you asked students to do was to provide their own self-assessment of their confidence in being able to perform the skill. So I'm always fascinated by that. Whenever I see students being asked to provide, how confident are you in your ability to perform these skills versus how that actually plays out in actual competence. So what did you find the relationship was between the student self-assessment and then what you evaluated their performance to be?
Yeah, no correlation whatsoever. We had incredibly high performers who felt that they weren't doing very well. And then we had very low performers who were very confident in their ability to perform these skills. So it was sort of all over the place. And we had high performers who were highly confident in their skills. But the takeaway was that there was no real predictable correlation between how somebody performed and how they thought they performed. And I would, we didn't look at this, but I would say that there might be a similar sort of effect if you were to ask trainers, like how effective of a training was that compared to an objective measurement of the actual performance outcomes. I think that I don't know that it would be such a big gap between those two, but it's not going to be dead on. And I think we had sort of an anecdotal evaluation of that because we talked with the trainers after the trainings and we all felt like it was a good training. It went well. Everything went to plan. Everything was done by the book and the way that it was supposed to be done. But then when we showed the trainers the actual objective measurements of the class performance, they were quite surprised that it wasn't quite as good as they expected it to be.
And that's something I think we consistently see in the motor learning research outside of law enforcement is that training effect or the illusion of learning. I've heard it referred to is that you think because especially during the training event, you experience your performance getting better. And then you make the mistake of equating performance gains during training with actual learning having taken place. And, you know, both the student and the trainer can be very easily deceived by that, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
And officers, recruits are not unique in their belief that they're all above average. I believe a lot of job performance surveys and research, psychological research demonstrates a similar phenomenon across disciplines, where if you ask employees how they think they compare to their coworkers, inevitably most people think they're in about the top 10%, and they all think they're above average.
Everybody's in the top 10%. Where's the other 90?
Everyone gets a trophy.
Exactly. So now in experiment 2, you were looking at, so there were, if I understand it correctly, and please clarify, but there was space sessions and scenario feedback that were sort of intertwined in scenario 2. So can you touched on it a little bit, but can you maybe expand on, so with the spacing effect and the scenario feedback, how did that work? What were those two aspects, and how did you evaluate those in that experiment?
Yeah, so they took a slightly different approach where they had a shorter initial training, but then they came back and retrained the skill at multiple time points. And then at the end of training, they had a scenario-based evaluation with feedback, which was designed to involve or introduce some level of stress to kind of test the person. You know, can you actually perform this with a certain level of stress involved as well? So what we found was that was actually helpful, especially obviously if you just did that and didn't provide any corrective feedback, it's probably not going to be useful if you just tested them, but they gave them feedback, which resulted in further improvement in performance of the skills. And we would obviously highly recommend that. The closer your training is to an actual real life experience, the better their performance is going to be out in the field. I mean, that makes logical sense. The question is, how much stress can you introduce without, you know, causing injuries, without completely throwing the person off? You know, you don't want it to be so stressful that they can't perform and that they completely fall apart. You want to gradually introduce stress so that you don't overwhelm them with those scenario-based trainings.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you clarified that, John, because we wouldn't want a trainer to hear the takeaway from what you just said to be, oh, so stress is good. Therefore, the more stressful I can make my training, the better the learning, because there is that sweet spot in training where you want to push your student into those desirable difficulties where it's contextual and real, but you don't want to push them over the edge of the curve where it's so stressful that the learning is greatly impaired. So when you say scenario training, because what might come to mind in most trainers' minds when they hear that word is like high fidelity, the big scenarios where they've got to decide between all of their tools and techniques and everything. Are you referring to that, or is it more like drills? Were they contextual drills where they had to perform that specific technique within the contextual realism of a drill?
Yeah, it was the latter. So they were the drill or the scenario was specifically designed for the use of particular skills. Obviously, the skills that were a part of this studies. So yeah, it's a scenario that's specifically designed to introduce some level of realism and some level of stress around conducting a particular skill.
And that was the scenario related to a disturbance at a convenience store, but it was held in the gym, and they put some mats down on the floor, and they had just a table that they brought in to pretend like that's where the register was, with the worker behind it. And there was someone that became very disruptive and violent, in which the officer was supposed to use a rear kneeling handcuff technique.
Okay. So I'm interested in the spacing. You spoke about how they would bring the officers back at certain intervals to re-examine the training. What was the spacing period, or was it variable?
It was about a week, wasn't it, in between?
It was 9 or 11 days.
9, yeah, so just over a week. And that's, it definitely makes the academy schedule much more complex, but this particular academy has a very well sorted out training schedule, and they obviously knew the benefits of refresher trainings, not just one block, but coming back and hitting that skill multiple times. So they deliberately work their schedule in that fashion so that they can come back and address the skill at multiple time points.
Okay, and would I be accurate to say when we train under conditions with that spacing effect, that is much more desirable as far as learning and retention of those skills than the big mass block, the one hit wonders where you do the mass block training and you never come back to it again?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and the skill performance over time maintained because of those space sessions, where we didn't see that from the other academies, which is huge. So at 8 weeks out or 2 months out, and the skill was performed at 8% accuracy, which was one of the highest scores across the study and across academies. So they had the initial training and then 3 more boosters, so 4 total training sessions, and they still had 80% accuracy 2 months later.
And we're talking about just, I think they were about 15-minute little booster sessions. So it's not a huge chunk of time, but so something as simple as 15 minutes every week to 2 weeks can help to maintain that skill.
Yeah, no, that's amazing to think of the value of even that short-term booster session, how that can help officers out. So you mentioned that they were given scenario feedback. So what type of feedback? Because there's a bandwidth of different type of feedback that trainers can give. On the one end, from being very trainer focused, this is what you did wrong, this is what you need to do to correct it, so do this, on the one end, to the other end, which is, say, a decision trainer who asking questions, probing for understanding, and helping the student self-organize and learn what they need to do. So when you say scenario feedback, what type of feedback was that?
Yeah, so this was specific to these skills. So they're pointing out, you did X, Y, and Z correctly. You need to work on this piece of the skill. So it was very focused on the individual skill. And then, I mean, you can see how if you start with that, then you can move towards the other example that you just gave, where you now start incorporating decision making. Like, was that even the correct skill to use in that situation? Could you have used a different approach? But we want them to master those skills first. There's no point in having a decision making component when they don't even have the skills mastered to the right level that we need initially. But that's where even with scenario based training, we feel that those should be gradually introduced and gradually made more and more complex as you go. But you certainly shouldn't jump straight from on the mats learning the skill to a full blown, highly stressful scenario based training. I mean, that's really just setting a lot of cadets up for failure.
Well, thank you for mentioning that so clearly, because like, look, here's the reality. I think most academies do exactly that. Is the bulk of the training time is in a very technique focused, closed, linear type of environment. And then right near the end of the academy, in the last few weeks, is they bring in the Kobayashi Maru scenarios and throw the student in to those scenarios. And then we wonder why we see such poor performance often in that, rather than, like you said, as soon as you can in the academy, start winding in contextual relevance. And I think it was Joan Vickers who used the phrase technique within tactics as soon as possible. So start making it contextual. And I like how you said it, you need to scaffold up the complexity as you go to try to approach as something as ecologically relevant and realistic as possible.
Yeah, I mean, just for a different example, in jujitsu, we do a lot of drilling, right? So that's just repeating the skill, repeat, repeat, repeat. But then it would be like going from that and throwing someone directly into a street fight without any open rolling or grappling in between. You're going from one extreme to the other without all those intermediate steps in between.
Right, exactly. So let's we didn't talk about really experiment 3, which was the block training with scenario feedback. So can you just describe how did scenario or experiment 3 differ from experiment 2? One was space sessions with scenario feedback and one was block training with scenario feedback. So what was the difference between those two approaches?
So I believe in experiment 3, there was one initial training session. And then half the class, we did a follow-up at 7 weeks post that initial training. And then all of the class that we could recruit to be tested again, tested at the 15-week mark. So what we were trying to do there was control for testing effects to see if we simply just expose individuals to one trial of the skill, is it going to have any impact on skill retention? So we're going to control for that. And we were quite surprised, but it did. Individuals that were tested at the 7-week mark scored 10% higher at 15 weeks than individuals that had no formal programmed exposure, a single trial of practicing the skill for those 15 weeks.
Right. So simply exposing someone to testing can have a long-term effect on the skill maintenance. And, you might think, well, why is that? They're not getting any feedback on the skill. But going back to what we were talking about before, what do you think those cadets are doing right after that testing? They're running through it in their head. They're thinking about, what did I do correctly? What did I do? What did I miss? Oh yeah, I should have done it this way. So that's probably where that increased skill maintenance comes from, is that simply exposing them to a test on the skill gets them thinking about it again and self-correcting and improving their own performance.
I think that's really important, what you both just said, again, to reinforce for trainers, and it's not well understood, is that with motor learning, is the bulk of the effective motor learning takes place offline, because of that process that you just said. You go through a drill or a scenario, and then for hours afterwards, and even during the sleep phase when it's being consolidated, that's when actually the learning can take place. And I think that's important for trainers also to understand the offline effects of learning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and the remainder of that study was what John said earlier, the most interesting for us, because John was invited out to actually go present on what dissecting their training and showing them data of their recruits' performance, which they took very seriously and immediately revamped how they train the skills and moved from one large training cohort, because they had a large recruit class of over 50 recruits, and breaking those down into 4 subgroups with one lead instructor for each subgroup. And we immediately saw an acceleration in performance to, I believe, right about 80%. I believe it was a 27% increase in performance, which was extreme for one, feedback trial of train a trainer into a change in the training approach itself, an immediate increase in recruit performance.
Yeah, so simply making each individual instructor, giving them a specific subset of the class to work with specifically, had a pretty profound effect on the performance. In addition to all the feedback that I gave them on how to teach the skill, how to provide corrective feedback. Yeah, it was very interesting to see that, something as simple as that can have a pretty big effect on the overall group performance.
Now, unfortunately, at the 16-week mark after the academy, so they graduated, they went into the field, they came back 4 months later and tested again, and performance dropped down to 60%. So we saw a 20% decrease from that 80%, which we could refer to that as mastery, a low B perhaps, to failing, to 60%, to a low D, to barely meeting that threshold of, if you want to call it, adequate performance. But that does not separate out the essential components of the skill from the non-essential. That's just a whole total score down to 60%. So from a research standpoint, what I think would be interesting is to combine an approach that involves experiment 2 and 3 of having those very short spaced sessions, to have consultants or a lead trainer within an academy come in and say, hey, I've reviewed how this is going, I've dissected it, I can point out how I think we can improve the way we're training, or focus on very specific sub-steps of overall skills to get the most bang for our buck. And then let's incorporate a scenario. Let's provide recruit focused decision-making feedback for them that's more open and more flexible and more centric on the recruit, the performer themselves, instead of instructor-led. And I wonder if that 60% would actually be much higher, since we saw 80% retention in study 2 after those 4 spaced sessions.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And so, one of the goals of the trainer's bullpen is to go to the experts in research and academia like yourselves, and then look at a study like this and bring the critical points of that study into law enforcement training so we can improve our practices. So if you were to give advice to, say, academy executives, law enforcement trainers, based on your research and your understanding and your expertise, what areas of advice, like what are the implications of this for trainers? What would you tell us to do differently?
I think the biggest takeaway from these studies is that we can be much more efficient and much more effective, even without additional resources. There are improvements to be made. Obviously, coming back and retraining once a year is definitely not the way to go. And I think every academy is probably going to have to do it slightly differently just because of their resources, their schedule, their staffing. So it's going to take an individualized approach. I don't think one academy can simply adopt another academy's approach. They need to look at the science, they need to look at studies like ours and incorporate what they can from these studies and from behavioral science as best they can for their particular academy and resources and staffing.
And so when we talk about like what do they have control over, what can they change without additional resources, what we mean is a single block of training, time and time again, has now been proven, 3 different academies, 3 different time zones, to not be effective. The skills are not mastered for the entire group of recruits. And if we don't have mastery from the inception of training, how can we possibly expect recruits to perform the skills at a high level on the street? And so what we, I think, argue is try and decrease the amount of time spent in that initial training session to increase a little time later and fit in those space sessions, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, little refreshers every couple of weeks within the academy, build on the skills systematically over time to get to a scenario-based training that's more skill-oriented, then incorporate some decision making. Maybe there are multiple trials with feedback in between that can still be brief, but really get the most bang for their buck. And another way to maximize what they already have is they already have instructors in the room. They already have bodies there, and those bodies have years or decades of experience. They're very high performers. So just getting them to convey their expertise to the recruits by providing that positive feedback and the constructive feedback about very specific, direct actions that the recruits are either taking or omitting. Or
And
doing.
take full advantage of any technology that you have. I mean, video modeling, video feedback. As Don mentioned, these trainers have decades of experience between them, but they're just a handful of folks. So put all of that knowledge online. So, maybe it has to be in-house. You don't want it getting outside of your particular department, but have it readily available online, whether it's on your servers. Have all those video models available so that cadets who are interested in learning outside of that training context on their own time have access to all that material on their free time.
Yeah, a training database. It can be encrypted, it can be on an internal server, it can be just volunteer, because some of the instructors would talk to us about how we can't assign homework. We actually can't do that. They're paid for their time here. We can't expect them to do that. Okay, but some officers take it upon themselves to continually train on their own time. They want access to that. So if you simply just make it available, or maybe incorporate the review and some video tutorials into in-services quarterly, those things could be helpful. And the technology exists, it's there, it's low cost, but it does take front end time and resources to develop those materials. But once you have them, then there could just be small modifications made over time.
Right. Those are great recommendations, because often what you hear is, trainers will always be saying, I need more time. I need more time with training. And arguably, we all should be arguing for more training time. But perhaps the more important question is, are we maximizing the learning during the time that we have? And so you've given some great ideas for trainers who don't have the authority or the power to change the academy approach, but they can certainly look at, what do I have? And I like your phrase, Don, what do I have influence over? What's within my circle of influence that I can adopt some of these important principles to help my students learn better? So that's so important. Now, I'm going to just ask a couple of questions, because I want to take advantage of your expertise in human performance and learning and your research. This may not have been something that you explored during this study, but I know you both have a breadth of knowledge in this area. So one of the things I'd like your opinion on is the amount of techniques that are taught to officers. And so when you go into a police agency or an academy, the span of different physical control techniques is just massive.
Mhm.
And a lot of them are not even like, for this type of a situation, you use this technique, for this situation, you use this technique. What's your advice, or what's your experience tell you with respect to the amount of techniques that we're trying to teach officers?
Yeah, I think in our paper we noted that on average there's over 100 individual motor skills taught in academies. So, I mean, if time and resources is the primary issue, then maybe we do need to take a look at those skills, and are all of them really necessary, or can they be grouped or organized in a fashion that is going to be more effective and efficient in the academy schedule? Well, and are some skills used so rarely that they're not necessary in the initial academy training? Perhaps they're taught as a special training after the academy. I don't know how that would work, but it certainly appears that we're expecting far too much from trainers and far too much from the amount of time that academies have to teach these skills. I mean, 100 different motor skills. If you dedicate an hour, that's 100 hours, and
And we know that's not enough.
and we know that that's
We know
not
that
enough.
even 100
Right.
hours isn't enough, and they simply don't even have 100 hours to
Right.
begin with when it comes to physical skills. And we know what we're saying right now is not new news to trainers, but what we hope, partially at least from our research, is that you can say, look, O'Neill said it. It's not just me. The researchers are saying it. They
Right.
found it. So we hope that we can provide a little bit more of a rationale for trainers to make some arguments to try to affect change within their own institutions.
Exactly. Yeah, we hope that trainers use our studies as the foundational argument for change within their academies. So it's an objective analysis to refer to. It's scientific. It's peer reviewed. It's solid evidence that what we're currently doing is not sufficient.
That's excellent. When you look at different types of movement, so biomechanics of movement, and I think one area where we could maybe take this approach that you're talking about of looking at all of our techniques is what is the commonality of biomechanics between multiple types of techniques. So for example, like a takedown versus a baton strike versus a knee strike, there's a lot of consistent biomechanics. Well, can we maximize our training time by looking at what are all of the different tasks and what are the consistent movements in biomechanics? And I think maybe if we take even an approach like that, trainers could look at and go, okay, we should be dedicating more time to this and this and this, because all these movement patterns are used in a variety of different threat environments. And maybe that would also be helpful.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, back to techniques. And this is where probably what you will say will be not a surprise to trainers as well. But when you looked at the specific techniques that were taught in the academies, why were those techniques taught? Like, did you ask trainers, did you ask academies, like, so where did you get why do you teach this rear disarm? Why do you teach this technique? What was the basis or the foundation for validating, or maybe that's not a good word because maybe there was no I don't know, why did they teach these techniques?
So some of them were tied down by state mandates that they had to train certain skills. They had to say they did it, they had to check the box, and they had no control over eliminating skills that they themselves did not believe were appropriate to be taught anymore, because maybe they were outdated, maybe there are other skills that were used, maybe it's an area of the country where it's just not required for a variety of reasons. So then they lose the ability to influence their training. And I think they lose then motivation even sometimes to really train skills to mastery. And that lessened motivation will be evident to the recruits, and they'll see, oh, this isn't really important. Maybe I don't need to try as hard. So it really has this trickle down effect, I think, is what I've observed. And the trainers were frustrated. The things we discussed with them, there were common themes across all academies that that they're all up against different mandates and different policy changes where new trainings are continually being added without evidence base to just say we need to do this.
Well, not to
And
mention,
nothing's omitted. It's
yeah,
just added.
and not to mention, you're going to teach this additional skill and you're not going to get any additional time to teach it. So figure out a way to work it into the schedule somehow.
Make it work.
But on top of what Don mentioned, there was also sort of a, well, this is how we've always taught it. This is how I was taught. This is how I learned. So we're doing what we're going to do it the way that we've always done it. So I think a more adaptive, I suppose, approach would be more appropriate. But yeah, there was definitely an aspect of this is how I was trained, so this is how we've always done it sort of idea.
Okay, John, when you say adaptive approach, can you just explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, so I mean, again, objectively looking at these skills, how they're used in the field, are they actually effective? Is this the most efficient and effective way to go about handling a particular problem? Or is there an alternative that shows some promise? And can we look at that? Can we gather some data and compare the two approaches and then make a decision based off of objective data instead of just simply continuing on as usual?
I appreciate those comments. When I was in charge of my academy, the DT and firearms sections of my academy, one thing that we had taught for years and years, well, we taught a lot of things, but we taught an angle kick, which was officers would rotate the hips and they drive their shin bone into the common peroneal nerve, an angle kick. And we had spent, I think we did a total of 12 hours throughout the whole time the cadets spent in the academy dedicated to teaching the angle kick. And so finally, someone had this brilliant idea to go, well, of all the techniques that we teach officers, what are they using on the street? So we did a survey and found out that in 3 years, not one of our officers on the street had ever used an angle kick. And then we had also taught the brachial plexus stun, where they'd hit somebody in the side of the neck with a brachial plexus stun. We looked at that. Are you using it? Nobody was using that technique. And so we started to go, well, why are we using? So in total, I think there was over 30 hours of training time in the academy that as trainers, we were trying to get our students to learn, and they weren't using it. They weren't using it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I think that that's an approach that trainers really should be taking, is a very healthy suspicion of needing to, we need to validate what it is that we're training. Why are we training these techniques? You'll be interested to know that the RCMP, so here in Canada, the RCMP is our big federal national police service, over 20,000 officers. They recently released a use of force analysis over 10 years of data, looking at what is it that officers do. And over 10 years, and especially within the last 6 years, the frequency of baton use is almost zero. And so I know this is not going to be palatable for trainers to hear this, but we have to have an evidence-based approach to what we're doing. Maybe it's time to hang up put the baton in the archive case, and instead the 15 hours that we use for baton training could be much more properly used to better benefit in the academy. So I know these are not popular things that we're talking about, but we really need to take this a research-based approach to this.
Right,
But if we're not, if academies aren't being given more time and resources, then they need to figure out workarounds, right? And one way to do that is look at the data, look at whether or not these skills are being used, and that can help inform how you can rework things, and maybe certain tools or certain techniques are just not being used and they can be substituted, or that time can be reallocated to something that is used on a regular basis.
and maybe there could be a voluntary training where you can sign up for baton training. So then you're not taking anything away from the instructors. You're just redistributing their time. And then officers that want that additional training can seek it out.
Right. Well, that's a good point. That's a really good point. So, well, we've been going for quite some time here, and so we will wrap it up, but I give you two the opportunity. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you wished I would have, something you want to say in relation to your research, or John, even give us a plug for your podcast, and how can our viewers find both of you? Give your contact information. And
So we have what's called the Public House podcast, and there's maybe 8 or 9 episodes up on there, and it's all about police academy training. We talk about these studies, and we have a handful of experts come in to talk about things like virtual reality and how that might be used in academy training and different technologies. But that's all on cbsinstitute.org. You can contact us through there as well. And I think one thing that I do want to mention is that our studies could be seen as a critique of police academy training, but it's really not meant as a critique. It's simply meant as an objective analysis to be used as the foundation for improving police academy training. So if any trainers out there would like to learn more about the studies, or just want to ask some questions and receive feedback, please feel free to reach out. We're always available.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having us, Chris. It was a
Thanks.
joy to talk to you today.
Yeah, it was great.
it's been my honor. Thank you for coming on. Okay, appreciate it. You two take care.
All right, cheers.
You as well.